The civil service chief stresses civil servants must be loyal to the chief executive and the SAR government. Seattle police used flashbang grenades to move protesters on the street as demonstrations against racism and police brutality continue across the U.S.
Hello and very good evening. Secretary for the Civil Service, Patrick Nip, says under one country, two systems, the city's civil servants are also the civil servants of the country.
He stressed political neutrality on the part of civil servants means they have to execute the government's policies well. Dong Yao-nie has more.
At the roundtable discussion today, Secretary for the Civil Service Patrick Nip weighed in on recent tensions between Hong Kong and the mainland. He said many of the contentious issues stemmed from cultural differences. Nip noted matters related to the mainland have always been the most disputable issues in the city. That's because both sides have different understandings on the meaning of one country, two systems. The head of the city's civil servants also underlined the importance of strengthening the national identity among some 180,000 government staff members. He said under the one country, two systems principle, civil servants in Hong Kong have a dual identity. They are both civil servants of the SAR and the nation, he said. Therefore, he asked the city's civil servants to put aside personal beliefs when it comes to policy making and implementation, adding that for them, political neutrality means thorough implementation of the government's policies. Earlier, Nip said civil servants should support Beijing's national security legislation for Hong Kong, calling that as a matter of course. Dong Yao-nie, TVB News.
As the first anniversary of the anti-extradition movement approaches, student organizations set up street booths today to promote the demands of protesters. Two student groups established street booths outside the clock tower in Tsim Sha Tsui. This after the police rejected their applications for holding a march in Kowloon today. The group has blasted the police for the decision and vowed to plan another protest for next Tuesday.
They use the Wuhan virus as a reason to give out the objection letter and they don't allow us to have a peaceful protest, and which is very unreasonable.
The government has issued a statement condemning recent calls for a referendum on a general strike in protest against the planned national security legislation. The condemnation came after a coalition of unions and a students group planned to hold the referendum on June 14th. The organizers say they would consider further action if more than 60% of the participants back a general strike. The government said the vote has no legal basis and accused the organizers of taking advantage of students to achieve their political goals. Executive Counselor Regina Ip seems to have changed her mind on having jurors hear national security trials.
She said she is no longer a supporter of that idea. Caleb Long has the details.
In 2003, when Regina Ip was the security chief, she led the government's bid to enact national security legislation under Article 23 of the Basic Law. It was proposed back then that all national security trials that may result in lifetime imprisonment should be jury trials. But Ip, who is now an executive councillor and lawmaker, said nowadays it's difficult to find truly impartial jurors.
From many recent cases, you can see that many jurors declare they have certain connection with the defendant. You can easily say that I'm an admirer of certain politicians, and then you don't have to serve as juror.
Ip also commented on the British government's stance on the British national bracket overseas passport. The UK said if China goes ahead with the new security law, it will allow BNO passport holders to remain in the country for 12 months on a renewable basis and grant them the right to work, which would place them on the route to citizenship. Ip called it a political gesture.
The new UK immigration rules will only admit immigrants who have the necessary skills, high salaries, or meet a certain shortage. If the UK substantially revised its rules so that 350,000 BNO passport holders could move to UK to work, it will still take them 6 years to acquire the right of abode in UK.
She also reminded the UK of its promise to Beijing.
If the UK offers a route to British citizenship, I think they are in breach of its memorandum on nationality, which they exchanged with China back in 1984. So they are in breach of their own undertaking.
Ip warned that the SAR can change its visa waiver agreement with the UK and limit British nationals' stay and their right to work in the city. KW TVB News.
Veteran Hong Kong Democrat Martin Lee says it's not too late to stop Beijing from enacting national security laws if the chief executive is willing to stand up for the city.
Lee also called on young pro-democracy protesters to be prepared to fight a long battle through legal means. Here's Haley Zhou.
Martin Lee, considered by many father of democracy in Hong Kong, is urging government officials to carry out their constitutional duty to stop the national security legislation. But isn't it too late?
Why too late? They formed the government. They can still go to Beijing and say, please, stop it. We will do it in Hong Kong. If there is a draft law, okay, it could take a little time. You don't have to pass a law with a lot of time if you have the majority, and they have. Instead of saying to the people, well, it's beyond our control, they legislate, hopefully it won't be too bad.
Lee says legislating national security laws under Article 23 of the Basic Law is the way to go.
Legislate under Article 23, but make sure that all our freedoms remain intact, because the Basic Law guarantees all our freedoms.
The government has been saying it has no say in this state-level legislation, but that there's nothing to be worried about.
Because it will be implemented within the framework of common law system in Hong Kong jurisdiction. How can our government officials guarantee anything? Oh, don't worry. Why do you say don't worry? How do you know what it is? They don't know what it is. The secretaries for justice, we control the prosecution. You think so? They want comprehensive jurisdiction. They will tell you what to do.
Lee thinks it would clear the way for Beijing to pass many other laws for Hong Kong and belittle the city's legislature.
The next one, I suppose, will be the extradition law. And our Legislative Council will be allowed to enact laws on bread and butter issues.
In the years leading up to the 1997 handover, there was a mass exodus of individuals. The new national security law has raised the specter of a similar trend. But is it in their best interest to leave?
It's up to individuals to decide what to do. And now, the British government and the US government are generously offering passports to Hong Kong people. But if all our good people were to leave Hong Kong, what will become of the city? It is our home. I don't want to leave.
At this juncture, what is the way forward for Hong Kong protesters? Should they burn together?
You cannot win this war, if you like, by using traditional arms. You don't even have them to begin with. And how can you beat the Chinese People's Liberation Army?
Then what means of resistance is left at Hong Kongers' disposal?
There are not too many things you can do lawfully when this national security law is passed in Beijing.
Haley Zhou, TVB News.
Overseas, millions in the United States refuse to stay quiet as protests continue over the death of a black man while in police custody.
The 12th day of demonstrations came as George Floyd was remembered in his hometown. Peter Caveas tells us more.
Protests against racism continue to grow in the United States. Tens of thousands marched in Washington, D.C. at the newly renamed Black Lives Matter Plaza. Millions of Americans refusing to stay quiet almost 2 weeks after George Floyd died.
I think it's amazing, especially because for so many years, Black history has not been taught in the actual school systems. I think it is important that we're out here to actually create history as well as being able to be a part of history.
Thousands marched on the streets of Brooklyn and Manhattan calling for an end to racial injustice and police brutality.
Black Lives Matter! Black Lives Matter!
Chanting, Black Lives Matter and hands up, don't shoot. The governor of New York State says demonstrators want to be heard.
What the people want is very simple. They want America as good as its promise. And that's what the protesters are saying. They're saying enough is enough. This is a national moment for change. And New York is going to lead the way on this change.
Protests were held across the country, some more violent than others. In Portland, police used tear gas to disperse crowds. Officers were also seen tackling protesters and holding them on the ground. Meanwhile, dozens gathered in a Minneapolis park Saturday to remember George Floyd and release balloons to honor lives lost at the hands of law enforcement.
And all of you are here and filled with love, and we are going to celebrate his life and spread, as I keep saying, peace, love, and justice around this world.
In North Carolina, a church near George Floyd's birthplace held a memorial service for him.
Today, if I would bring away that we can come together, there can be a change made, and just seeing everyone just paying their respect and being willing to make a change.
46-year-old George Floyd died May 25th in Minneapolis after a white police officer pinned him to the ground and kneeled on his neck. Peter Caveos, TVB News.
In related news, 2 officers in Buffalo, New York have been charged after shoving a 75-year-old man. Robert McCabe and Aaron Trogalski appeared in court on Saturday, where they pleaded not guilty to second-degree assault. The pair were released on their own recognizance. A crowd of off-duty officers, firefighters and others gathered outside the courthouse to show support for the accused officers. A district attorney said the policemen crossed a line when they shoved Martin Gugino hard enough for him to fall backwards and hit his head on the sidewalk. The 75-year-old remains in hospital. The officers were suspended without pay after video emerged of the incident. All 57 members of an emergency response team who were angered over their fellow officers' suspensions resigned from the unit, but not from the force. If convicted, the 2 cops face up to 7 years in prison.
Demonstrations against the death of George Floyd took place not just in the United States, but also in many European capitals.
Well, Floyd's death at the hands of police has struck a chord with people protesting against discrimination and injustice all around the world. Protests against the death of George Floyd and police brutality towards minorities continued in other parts of the world, including Europe. In Berlin, up to 15,000 people rallied at the German capital's Alexander Square, where protesters chanted Floyd's name and held up placards with slogans such as "Stop Police Brutality" and "I Can't Breathe." There were similar demonstrations elsewhere in Germany, including in Munich, where at least 20,000 rallied, while thousands more protested in Frankfurt and Cologne. Over in Paris, several thousand ignored a protest ban issued due to the coronavirus pandemic and assembled within sight of the US Embassy.
I'm here for not only the people who have been victims to police brutality, but for all Black people who can't walk down the street without feeling safe, who deserve to feel protected by the people who are supposed to protect them.
One of the biggest European protests was in London, where tens of thousands rallied at Parliament Square, invoking Floyd's memory, as well as people who died during police encounters or indifference in Britain. Like in France, the protest took place despite advice from the UK government not to gather in crowds because of the coronavirus.
People are finally realising that change needs to happen.
After a largely peaceful day, small numbers of protesters threw bottles at police near the Prime Minister's residence. Officers on horseback and riot police charged at protesters to push them back. London police said one officer required hospital treatment after falling from her horse. Before Saturday's protest in London, the US ambassador to Britain condemned Floyd's death and said America needed to do more to fight racism and injustice. And a warm welcome back to TVB News. For the second straight day, at least 80 millimetres of rainfall was recorded in parts of the city.
At one point, the red rainstorm warning was in effect for more than 3 hours. Kana Chu reports.
Rumbles of thunder and heavy rain hit the city in the early hours of Sunday morning. Over the past 2 days, the downpour was the heaviest in New Territories East.
A trough of low pressure brought heavy showers and scattered from the coast of Guangdong yesterday and today.
In Mayaotong village, the increasing water level was visible. Sacks of trusty sandbags were no use in stopping washed-away objects from blocking doors. With villagers trapped inside their homes, firefighters were deployed.
We've been seeing the problem for the last few years, a material problem. All this area, right, will flood. The chief of the village probably is aware of the problem, but then it's very hard to get anyone to look after us or look at the issue.
In areas including Sai-Kung, Sha-Tin, and Taipo, more than 150 millimeters of precipitation was recorded. At 6:20 this morning, the observatory issued an amber rainstorm warning, followed by a more serious red rainstorm warning roughly an hour later. That's in addition to the landslide warning, cautioning people of collapsing slopes like this one at the Sha-Tin section of Taipo Road. Many waterfalls were simply torrents of rain in disguise. In Taipo, water filled a pedestrian underpass where cleaners scrambled to unclog the drain. Cornwall Street in Kowloon was one of the many urban areas dealing with ankle-deep water. More than 11,000 lightning flashes were recorded this morning. It wasn't until 11 a.m. that the rain began to subside. By half-past noon, all storm warnings were cancelled. The Hong Kong Observatory expects an average to above-average amount of rainfall this summer season. Kana Chu, TVB News.
Hong Kong reported one imported coronavirus case from the Philippines today, bringing the overall infection tally to 1,106. The city has not had a local case for 3 straight days. This comes as top microbiologist Yuen Kwok Young says it is impractical to expect COVID-19 to be totally eliminated. Citing the city's density, the government health advisor pointed out the difficulty in avoiding the spread of viruses. Still, to stem the invisible circulation of COVID-19, Yuen Kwok Young recommended authorities increase deep throat saliva sample tests from 5,000 to 7,000 a day. He also wants people to make wearing face masks a habit. Authorities are still investigating the source of an infection concerning a patient cluster emerging from Luk Yuen Estate in Sha-Tin.
Meanwhile, senior Chinese officials released a lengthy report today on the nation's response to the coronavirus pandemic. They defended their government's actions and said China had provided information in a timely and transparent manner. Officials said China was quick to share information such as the genome sequence for the new virus with the WHO, as well as relevant countries and regional organizations. An Associated Press investigation found recently that Chinese government labs delayed releasing the genetic map of the virus back in January. And this delayed its identification in other countries and the sharing of information needed to develop tests, drugs, and a possible vaccine.
2 men were arrested in the early morning for allegedly attempting to steal prizes from a claw machine store. Boxes of toy models were left on the floor while 2 were taken away by police officers. The crime happened at around 5 a.m. at Kwai Chung Plaza, where the 2 allegedly used excessive force to shake the machines. The storekeeper alerted the police after finding out what was going on through the shop's security camera.
And that is our news for Sunday night.
Thanks for watching.
Bye.
Good night.